All right, everybody. Hello, everyone. How are you? As you guys know, you're on mute. I'm going to suggest that you put your computer into speaker mode, which is in the upper right-hand corner, so you can see me. And a few of the slides and things that I'm going to show today will be review for people who've logged in before. But I know we also have some people who are new to the Brulium virtual tastings. So it won't be review for them. So hopefully there will be new facts and new fun ideas for everybody. As you know, today we are talking about the Santa Lucia Highlands and what makes wines from that specific AVA so very distinctive and so special. So if you haven't poured yourself a glass of wine yet, please go ahead and do so. Whether it's from the Santa Lucia Highlands or from somewhere else, whether it's a craft beer or whether it's Cabernet or whether it's Sauvignon Blanc, we welcome you to join us with whatever you have. And as always, we'll begin by asking a couple random people to tell us where they're from and what they're drinking. And I'll ask you guys to unmute yourselves. So I see Stephanie there. So Stephanie, why don't you unmute yourself, tell us your name and where you're from and what you're drinking.
I'm like, am I unmuted? I'm from San Diego and we just opened the rosé.
Awesome. How's your weather down there? Rosé weather?
It's very rosé. It's almost 90. It's hot.
Yeah, perfect. And I think I saw, like, was that part of Kennedy's head that came in and out of the field there for a minute?
No, that was my cat.
Oh. I saw something come in and out of the field. That was funny. All right. Awesome. And let's see, why don't I ask, we have guest industry member here. So why don't we ask Lisa to unmute and share where she's from and what she's drinking and what she does. Lisa Brayton.
Oh, there I am. Hi. My name's Lisa, and I am from Paradise Vineyard's 37 Wines, also a member of the Petaluma Gap AVA. And I just sat down, so I haven't opened a bottle of wine yet.
Oh, well, go and do so. You have plenty of time, and we hope you'll
do so. But thank you for letting me join in. It's great to see you and to see all of your fans.
Thank you. It's fun to have everybody here connecting, so that's great. All right, guys, so let's sort of dig into the Santa Lucia Highlands, which most of you guys know is a small AVA. In contrast to Sonoma County, you know, Sonoma County, as everybody knows, reaches from Marin to Mendocino and all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the Mayacama Mountains. So again, like 85, almost 85 miles long, almost 65 miles wide. So that's really, really big. In a stark contrast, the Santa Lucia Highlands is teeny, teeny, teeny. It's about 18 miles long and 2 miles wide. It's a very different infrastructure for hospitality, different in terms of tourism, and obviously different in terms of size, but you'll see the themes of maritime influence, of fog, and of wind come up again and again, as they always do when we're talking about regions that are ideal for Pinot Noir. So let me start with a couple pictures here. I'm going to share my screen. So Santa Lucia Highlands, what makes it sing? And you can see a beautiful picture here of the SLH nestled against the mountains. Those mountains are on the western side, so right on the other edge of those mountains is the Pacific Ocean. So I thought I would start with, here we go, technology. I thought I would start with this slide, which I think you may have seen before if you were joining me 2 or 3 weeks ago. And again, what it emphasizes is that the Santa Lucia Highlands suffers a little bit from being the, you know, the old joke about the Brady Bunch, Marsha, Marsha, Marsha. Santa Lucia Highlands is the Jan of Pinot Noirs. It has an awesome reputation. all of the wines being made in the Santa Lucia Highlands are of extraordinary quality, small batch production, boutique operations, family-owned wineries, impeccably farmed, but not that many people know about it. It's sort of one of those under-the-radar AVAs, which makes it fun, but it also makes it ripe for education. So I'm delighted that I can bring a little bit more knowledge about this really special region to all of you. So I love that Antonio Galoni talks about the Santa Lucia Highlands as being the best value for the money in terms of reliability for consumers. So in other words, when he reviewed all of the Pinots from SLH, he didn't find a dud among them. And that's because SLH is so small. Because as I said, everything is small production, really, really well done. And let's see, excuse me for 1 second. I want to try to bring people. Brian, can you bring in the waiting room people for me? I don't know if you can hear me. It's all really small production, which is why when you see the word Santa Lucia Highlands on a label, it's the best indicator of reliability for domestic Pinot Noir and domestic Chardonnay. I also love that the Wall Street Journal called this our favorite AVA that nobody knows about. So I'm going to bring it back to everybody here. Raise your hand if you've had Pinots from the SLH besides mine. Awesome. So I'm going to call on Stephanie and Dave. Do you want to unmute and tell us a little bit about some of the adjectives or ideas that go with Santa Lucia Highlands?
Well, hi there.
Hi, how are you, Dave?
Good. I just wanted to start off that we just finished a bottle from our legacy cellar here. It's a 1994 Shug Sonoma Valley Cabernet Sauvignon Heritage Reserve. If we're going to go with the virus, I don't want our heirs to inherit it. We'll drink it now, enjoy, and see what comes.
Well done.
No, the wine from the Santa Lucia Highlands, usually find them pretty jammy, fruit forward, really linger on the palate, which is one of the things really enjoy about it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think they have a reputation as being sort of a bigger style of Pinot Noir, meaning they can be a little bit more extracted. And yeah, I do think they do tend to have a really long finish. And there's something about the texture and the smoothness of wines from that region that really lends itself to that long lingering finish. And I think that's true for my wines and for other producers doing wines from this region. Anybody else have thoughts on SLH sort of generally, broadly? Nope. No one likes being called on, huh? All right, so back we go. So, you know, I just thought I'd bring in another picture here because when you look at the Santa Lucia Highlands, you're not seeing tasting rooms, you are not seeing Michelin restaurants, you are not seeing adorable boutique purveyors of fine cheese and very expensive gardening trowels. It is just impeccably farmed. It's a little bit like Burgundy in that it's small vineyards, patched work from the valley floor up the mountains. Again, it's vineyard centric as opposed to being winery centric. The two big wineries that anchor the Santa Lucia Highlands are Han and Mère Soleil, and neither are actually that big. The lack of tourism infrastructure in the Santa Lucia Highlands itself is almost a detriment when we bring the somms out there for somm camp, because on one hand, we're able to immerse them in the vineyard and they can feel the fog, they can feel the wind, and they really get a deep dive into the agriculture. But on the other hand, it does make it hard for us to give them the whole food and wine experience just because the infrastructure isn't there. And that is something that's very special and rare and sort of brings me to the next idea of the Santa Lucia Highlands. Last week, when we were talking about Zinfandel, one of the more compelling ideas about California old vine Zinfandel are the stories. And I think that Santa Lucia Highlands very much has an identity that is steeped in stories and mythology. And I think that's one of the reasons why I am so deeply drawn to this region. So when you look at it here, you see the Salinas Valley, and this tells you that we are in Grapes of Wrath country. This is Cannery Row. This is the land of California that Steinbeck wrote about. And so there's this sort of deep literary history around this region, sort of the idea of California pioneers, a pioneering spirit, a farming spirit. And I think that authenticity really imbues everything about this region, from the styles of winemaking, of course, to the farming partners that I have. And there's sort of this magical lore to Santa Lucia Highlands that I think is what has captivated me from the very beginning. So, I mean, we can start with everything else that's growing there. So I always joke, let me look to everybody here for a minute. This is the question I always ask everybody. Can you guess the #1 most popular crop in Monterey County? Anyone have a hand up? Can anyone guess? Okay, Mike. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Garlic.
Good guess. That is true in Gilroy, but not in Broadley, Monterey. Go ahead, Alan. What do you got?
I'm going to guess artichokes.
That's a good guess. The Pizzoni family does indeed grow artichokes and asparagus. Nope. Okay, go ahead, Chris. Fields down in Illinois.
Lettuce.
Good guess. It is the green lettuce belt of California. And when you get to Salinas, there is a giant cutout of a farmer down on one knee with a dole sign standing over the lettuce fields. But according to my friend Joe McIntyre down in the Santa Lucia Highlands, the #1 crop is strawberries. Anyway, just a fun trivia question. So again, stories, lore, authenticity. So story has it that the Pizzoni family, from whom I source my grapes, they started farming in other crops. And one year, Gary Pizzoni's parents had a bumper crop of celery. And legend has it that Gary Pizzoni begged his mom and dad to take the cash from that bumper crop. Oh, please, let me plant some grapevines. And that is the story of the lore and the origin of SLH. Now, indeed, Gary Pizzoni is one of the most colorful characters that you will ever meet. Nicky Hahn, the late Nicky Hahn, was probably at the forefront. But the story everybody tells about SLH is Gary Pizzoni and his bumper crop of celery. And in fact, during harvest now, Gary's son Mark sends me a supply of vegetables with almost every single grape sample he sends to me up here in Santa Rosa. So I'll go to his brother's winery, and leading up to harvest, every 3-4 days, he sends me a giant gallon Ziploc of grapes from my block. And in addition to the grapes, I'll often find bags of romaine lettuce, cauliflower, beets, all kinds of other California farming crops, because that's actually where their family's business is. That's the bulk of their business. I do believe they're the #1 exporter of asparagus to Japan. Another interesting fact. So Gary Pizzoni was one of the guys at the forefront of marketing this region. And again, like I said, I love to talk about the lore. And when we look at this vineyard map of the Santa Lucia Highlands, again, the first thing you see is that it's small, it's narrow, it's more red wine than white wine. It's mostly Pinot, and then Chardonnay, and thirdly Syrah. And you can see the Soberanes vineyard highlighted in yellow. And next door, you see a vineyard called Gary's. Gary's S apostrophe, which is named so because it is owned by two guys named Gary. And Gary Pizzoni's mom joked that Gary Pizzoni and his best friend down the street, Gary Franscioni, played with toy tractors when they were little, and they still play with big boy toy tractors now. So they collaborated with the Gary's Vineyard. And at a time, it really arguably became probably the best known vineyard in that area. Gary's, farmed by two guys named Gary. Has anyone out there seen a wine with Gary's on the label? Yes, yeah. People who know SLH, that's probably one of the first vineyards that they'll gravitate to. So Gary Pizzoni, wanting very much to capitalize on the success of Gary's Vineyard, really wanted to plant the land that was next door. But Gary is loud, Gary is colorful, he's known for throwing parties, he is known for being extremely generous with his marijuana crop. They did not exactly want Gary planting their land. But being as persuasive as he is, he ultimately strong-armed them into a lease. And so he planted the Soberanes vineyard with his son Mark taking the lead in 2006. The initial crop was in 2010, and I've been with that vineyard ever since. And like the Gary's Vineyard, there is a mythology and a story to this vineyard. It's named for Vasquez Soberanes, who was a Mexican explorer who was coming up to explore the Americas. He was deeded this property in a land grant from the Mexican government, and a land grant that predated the American Revolution. And when he got this initial parcel of land, you probably can't, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but it fanned out in a giant fan all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was a massive land deed. And in fact, today, there's a Soberanes Pass in Big Sur. And it's not even contiguous with the vineyard, of course, but it just goes to show you the expanse that this land parcel once was. The other fun fact about the Soberanes vineyard is that it's planted to a California suitcase clone. Does anyone know what a suitcase clone is? Mike, we'll let you take it away. We'll let you gotta unmute.
I got it. There we go. I think it has to do with there were some vines that were smuggled back from France, from Burgundy, in a suitcase by one of the Garys, and I think it was Francione.
You're right. So
that's wrapped up in its underwear.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So a suitcase clone refers to sort of any illegal plant material that was smuggled, very common with Pinot Noir and Burgundy, that was smuggled over from France illegally and planted here in the United States. And the reason I say illegally is that this all goes back to the days of phylloxera. And in the 19th century, you know, there was a lot of cross trading of plant material between Europe and the United States. And it wasn't just grapevines. I mean, it was lots of ornamental plants as well. But ultimately, that cross-contamination led to California giving phylloxera to France. And of course, then ultimately, the whole idea of how we plant vineyards in a modern way, using a rootstock in a clone, which is like an outfit. So the rootstock would be your pants. That's the part under the ground that you don't see. And the clone is like your shirt or your jacket, whatever you do see. And just as when you go to Nordstrom and there's shirts of different brands, clones are the same way. It's a piece of plant material that is genetically identical to the plant where it came from. And there is a legacy in California of illegal plant material, suitcase clones, also called California heritage clones. And indeed, the lore is exactly as what Mike said. Gary went to France. He went to DRC. He snuck over to Domaine Romanée Conti in the dead of the night when he cut some canes and smuggled them back to his hotel, wrapped them in his underwear, and brought them back here to California. And he used those very plants to seed his entire vineyard. So, you know, I can neither confirm nor deny that allegation at this time. But what I can tell you is if you can see my cursor. So Gary's vineyard hits the road on this main drag driving through. It happens to be called River Road. And it is indeed true that the front 4 rows of the vineyard that are closest to the road are actually Syrah and not Pinot Noir. So now in turn, if vineyard thieves drive down River Road and in turn try to steal Gary's proprietary Pizzoni clone, which has allegedly come from Domaine Romanée Conti, they will end up with Syrah instead of Pinot Noir. So now I've sort of told you a little bit about all of the mythology and the stories that drew me into the region. And you may be wondering, how the heck did it come to be that you fell in love with this weird little teeny esoteric area? Because actually the first Pinot I made, the very first Brouillon vintage in 2008, came from the Santa Lucia Highlands. And for that story, we need to travel way back in time, to 2003. And that was the time that I finished my second pathology fellowship. I had passed my pathology boards. I was pregnant with Bruno and taking some time off for maternity leave. And on a lazy weekend, I was reading the Wall Street Journal. And back then, the reviewers from the Wall Street Journal were a lovely couple, Dottie and John. And they had a wonderfully accessible way of speaking about wines that drew you in. And as it happened, they were talking about Pinot from the Santa Lucia Highlands. And I read that article, and it very much changed my life. So I was reading the article, and this is what I read. Massive cherry, berry lilac, roasted nose you can smell across the room. Absolutely chewy, rich nose, bursting with fruit. Classy and tight, with Bing cherries and blackberries. Serious wine, clearly expensive, layered with tobacco, cedar, vanilla, and spices. It's like a meal with a long finish. Truly classy with a touch of cream. I could wear this behind my ears, Dottie said. A rich, mouth-coating splendor. And sure enough, you can see circled there, that happened to be a wine from Gary's Vineyard. And I read that article in the New York Times in 2003, and I ordered that bottle of wine off the website for Minor Family and opened it at home, and I was like, holy cow. That was my sort of domestic Pinot Noir eureka moment. Give me a show of hands. How many of you guys have had that wine eureka moment? Oh, come on. I know you don't have to share it. Just tell me you've had one, right? Like there's been that bottle of wine, that place you visited, and maybe you've had more than one, where you uncork a bottle of wine with a meal, or you're on vacation, or you're in a tasting room, or you go to your local wine shop and you discover this new brand and you take it home and you're like, holy cow, this is amazing. It blows your mind. for me, sort of the big difference was it blew my mind and I changed careers. And that was really when I decided that, you know, I think I want to be a winemaker. This is something that I want to explore, and this is what I want to do. And I think a lot of you guys have heard the follow-up to this, which was, you know, back then I started cold calling people looking for fruit. And due to ignorance and naivete and having plenty of moxie, I had the gumption to call up Mark Pizzoni and say, hey, I read this article in the Wall Street Journal and it talked about Gary's Vineyard. Do you have any of that Gary's fruit that you could sell me? And rather than laughing me off the phone, he said, you know, we have this new vineyard. It's called Soberanes. It's going to be ready for harvest in 2010. Why don't you come on down and let's see if our families get along? And I think 80% of you know this story, but for those of you who haven't, I'll tell it again. So we pack the kids into the car. We drive down from Sonoma to Santa Lucia Highlands. The kids were very young then. It's like a 4.5 hour drive. We get there. We finally arrive. What do the kids have to do? Yes, everyone's nodding. The kids need the bathroom. So we unload the van. The kids traipse into Gary Franscioni's house, which is this beautiful Italianti style villa with these beautiful tiled floors. And Bruno trots off to the bathroom. He's gone for a while the twins are terrorizing his small dog. Finally, Bruno comes back with a triumphant smile on his face saying, Mom, I pooped so big it won't flush. Yeah. Gary Franscioni also still tells the story about how Bruno clogged his septic system. And luckily, we're all friends now. It's all good. They are very patient, authentic, lovely people. So this just sort of is the nuts and bolts of Santa Lucia Highlands grape growing. So it's again within the broader umbrella of Monterey County. But the late Nicky Hahn realized that this small crescent of territory was so uniquely situated that it should be its own AVA. The growing conditions there were just that much better for Pinot Noir than Monterey County broadly. So it was he who really initiated the AVA and modern grape growing. It's been an AVA since 1991. You can see about 30% of it is planted to vines. Much of the valley floor is planted. Less of the mountainside is planted. It can be very rigid, very steep and rigorous planting. Parts of the highest elevation vineyards owned by the Pizzonis are almost like tiptoeing along edges in Burgundy. So what makes this region so great? You know, when we talk about the Petaluma Gap, which we've talked about a lot, we talk about the fact that it's a byproduct of the topography and the mountain range and the orientation of that mountain range of the Mayacamas drives the fog and drives the wind. Santa Lucia Highlands is very much the same way, except the mountain's underwater. So it's called the Blue Grand Canyon. It's exactly what it sounds like. It is a big crater underneath the water. But needless to say, the jet of ocean water from the Pacific going into Monterey Bay is among the coldest along the entire coast of California. And that's because of this deep, deep canyon leading into the mouth of Monterey Bay. And so this cool jet of ocean water pushes into the bay. And as you can imagine, it's the same themes you guys always hear. You get fog in the morning and you get wind in the afternoon. So let me show you a cartoon and then we'll sort of discuss in what ways is it actually different from Petaluma Gap. So this is a cartoon really of what I showed you before. It's very cool, less abrupt sunshine. You get all of that coastal influence from Monterey Bay with the strong daily wind Down there it says maximum 25 to 30 miles an hour. That is intense. To put it in perspective, it is so intense that if Gary Franscioni doesn't hose down the bocce court, you can't play. It's a friggin' sandstorm, if that gives you a measure of intensity. So that wind is so intense that, of course, it thickens the skins as it does in the Petaluma Gap, and it shuts down photosynthesis. The plants just can't take it anymore. They shut down the stomata of the leaves and photosynthesis stops. The grapes thicken their cuticle. You're going to get more color. And even in Santa Lucia Highlands, it's a different color than you get for Pinots in Sonoma County. And shutting down photosynthesis, of course, gives us that long hang time. And I think that's probably one of the things that helps contribute to the texture and the long finish that Alan pointed out as being a characterization of the AVA across multiple winemakers. So shutting down photosynthesis means that even though sugar accumulation has stopped, tannins continue to develop and acids continue to develop. So the phenolic indicators of ripeness continue to mature even as sugar accumulation slows down. And I think that's one of the most fun things about the SLH Pinots is that sexy, sexy mouthfeel. I'm drinking a 2012, which is super fun. And it is so beautiful on the palate. It's this smooth, velvety, rippling mid-palate and weight. The acidity is still bright and lively. It's just got a gorgeous, gorgeous texture. So coming back to share mode again, right? So some of these are themes we talked about with the Petaluma Gap, the idea that it maintains acidity, it mitigates botrytis by drying out any fog pressure. So I think you guys have seen this picture before, but I put it up because one of the other really fun parts about Santa Lucia Highlands is that it really gives me room for exploration. It's really one of the vineyards where I've really enjoyed playing and trying different techniques. And that's been true from the beginning. So back in my early winemaking days, so back in 2010, that very first vintage that I got from Mark Pizzoni, I had this idea, like, wouldn't it be cool to have a submerged cap? It's like a Rhone technique. I'm not even sure where I got this, like, ridiculous idea. No one does submerged caps for Pinot. But, like, I'm like, oh, this would be super cool. And I've always been inspired to try new things. So the picture that you see of Bruno is Bruno foot treading the whole cluster. So that's one of the fun things with Santa Lucia Highlands, because it's like a big boy pants Pinot. It's got that broad, beautiful texture. It does well with whole cluster. So in both of these pictures, in different vintages, you can see Bruno decked out in his practice Speedo, foot treading the whole cluster to try to break down the fruit when it's really tough and harder to deal with before it starts to release its juices. And then this is an awesome picture. I dug this out of my old picture file. And this is the data from the very first vintage from Soberanes Vineyard in 2010. And you can see this technical picture on the side where I've written evenly spaced holes with smiley faces. So this whole idea for this submerged cap was that I would put this thick piece of food grade plastic into the bin and hold down the skins and the seeds below the level of the juice. So in theory, you don't need to punch it down. So you're always extracting. And of course, as you guys know, fermentation offloads all this carbon dioxide. So I had tap plastic drill these holes so that the carbon dioxide could bubble out. Of course, I didn't quite factor in how we would get that plastic thing to hold down. So I had some 2x4s and some inverted picking bins for the olives and these straps that I would ratchet down. And it was cool. It was fun. It was a story to tell. And indeed, the anthocyanins were higher when I measured them with the submerged cap than in Pinots without the submerged cap. But it wasn't anything that was journal worthy. I tried to put together this funny little video from that year. God, I look so young. But videos tend to not work well, so I'm just going to move to the end, to the next picture, which is really just in here to illustrate the wind factor. As I joke, this is my supermodel picture, but it's really just a picture of the wind pulling back my hair. So this is just a beautiful picture of the Soberanes vineyard. And if you're drinking Pinot from SLH, this is about the time where I'm going to ask you to pick it up and give it a sniff. Because Pinots from this region open up so beautifully. They become so incredibly expressive and complex and layered with air. And with time. And aptly, as it opens up, I have this beautiful picture of bud break from 2012 that Mark Pizzoni sent me one morning when he was out in the vineyard. Terroir, right. So, yeah, terroir is great. So that's a made-up word from Randy Caprasso at the Somm Journal, who's a big fan of Santa Lucia Highlands. And you've all heard of, you know, the terroir, but terroir is a word that he made up to talk about SLH. And it's the idea that the grapes there pick up the scents and the aromatics of all of the native California flora that surround the vineyard. So there's wild herbs and chaparral, and those very much inform sort of those savory notes that you get with SLH Pinot that makes it special. All right, so let's see. I had a few more. What did I not talk about? Okay. So let's see. There are two things. So talking about whole cluster, the pros and the cons. So Soberanes Vineyard is the only vineyard where I do whole cluster. When I do whole cluster, I really try to ferment in an oak vessel. I find that that works really well together. I find that the stem tannins really can expand mid-palate and give a beautiful sense of texture when it's fermented in an oak vessel. Because some of the oak, not the toastiness, because they're neutral or not toasted, like the big tanks aren't toasted, but some of the ligands in the wood of the tank help bind with some of those stem tannins early on during fermentation, and you really start building that beautiful mid-palate early. It also helps increase some of those savory notes like black tea and some of the herbal notes that give the Soberanes vineyard and Pinots from this region sort of that depth of character, that broodingness, that's dark brambly fruit, but other things in addition to just fruit. So that was fun. And then the other thing was the weather pattern. The other interesting part about the SLH and the wind is that in SLH, the wind started at 2 o'clock. And that's 2 hours earlier than they pick up in the Petaluma Gap, which is salient because the grapes in SLH are not hitting the peak temperature of the day, right? Like 3, 4, 5 o'clock is the hottest time of the day. That's when the wind comes through in the Petaluma Gap and it drops the temperature. In contrast, in Santa Lucia Highlands, those grapes, the way they're nestled in that little valley between two mountain ranges, they never see the full sun of the day. They never get the full heat because the wind starts to push off the ocean at 2 o'clock. So it's never, never hot there. It gets warm, but it's never hot. So anyway, those were the couple points that I didn't get to on the slides. And I don't know if Brian's coming out here with the list of questions. I saw him peek out here. Let's see. Maybe I can look in the chat box. Ah, here comes Brian with the questions. All right.
All right. Let's see. There is a question about CHO, what it is and what it means.
Ah, CHO, sugar. So forgive me, yes, CHO, C6H12O6. It's a glucose molecule, and I abbreviate glucose as CHO. Sorry about that. Yes.
How do you determine the alcohol content? I had a 2016 SLH with 13.7%. Yours is 14.8.
Yep, absolutely. So alcohol is determined by the starting sugar and when you pick. So when was that one that was higher? What vintage was that?
Maybe the 16.
Okay.
I don't have it in front of me.
Okay, so I have found with SLH, especially in the early years as a young vineyard, the fruit just didn't taste good until it started to hit like 25, 26 bricks. In contrast, San Giacomo Vineyard tastes great. Sometimes, some years I picked that at like 22 bricks. And it's just when the fruit starts to taste good for the place that it's grown. And the amount of sugar that you start with is going to determine the alcohol that you have at the end, because every molecule of glucose is converted into ethanol. So that's a good question. The other interesting thing I've been finding in more recent vintages, like 17, 18, is that Soberanes is starting to taste more delicious at a lower bricks. And I think some of that is the vineyard really coming into its own as it grows up from being a just born vineyard to, you know, 10, 12 years in the planting.
Let's see. Does the wind in SLH function as a way to limit insects, like in CDP?
Oh, I don't know. That's really a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I can ask people in SLH and I can email the answer when I find out. But that's a really good question. Sometimes you'd think it would push bugs in one direction, and in some ways you might think it would be a screen or a shield. I don't know. That's a good question.
And I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember the answer to this, but is the 12 Soberanes the same wine that you had in the picture that you were drinking after the twins were born?
Oh, no, after the twins were born, that was a Margaux.
You're right.
That was Chateau Margaux. So after Bruno was born, we had a Brunello di Montalcino from Uccelliera, from Andrea Cortinesi. And when the twins were born, we had a bottle of Margaux. Good question.
That is the extent of the questions in
All
the
right.
chat box. So I don't know if you want to let people ask.
Yeah, if people have other questions about Santa Lucia Highlands, feel free to, where are we at? 5:45, okay, so we're right on time. So if people have other questions, raise your hand and feel free to unmute yourself. I gave you guys a lot of information.
That one.
Go ahead, Mike, yeah.
So we love all the wines that you make so far. What's next? What's the next frontier?
I don't know, that's a good question. So last year, I briefly tried to twist Brian's arm to make a still Sauvignon Blanc. That fell on deaf ears. Maybe we will bring back the late harvest SB because we're just about sold out. So that's definitely sort of like an every 2-year kind of project. And it was super fun to make. So maybe I'll be able to bring that back. And you know, a ton of fruit with late harvest goes a long way. So maybe bringing in a ton of that. I've always wanted to make port. That's the other one Brian has put the kibosh on.
The CF no?
The CF no. The CF no rises
That's
again.
my life too.
I have all these big ideas. Crushing my dreams.
Chuck is asking about the 17 vintage that we haven't released yet. How it's shaping up.
Yes, the 17 vintage is tasting delicious. So I almost said to Brian, I said, should we open a 17? And then I thought it wasn't fair because last week with the Zinfandel, I had opened up the new release that nobody has yet. So we decided to go backwards with the 12. But yeah, the 17 definitely speaks to place. Savory, deeper notes. As you know, this guy takes a little bit longer for all of those components to come together in the bottle, which is why we hold it back until the fall. And I can't wait to release it. It's going to be delicious.
Gareth, would you ever consider making a Syrah?
I don't know. That's a good question. I have a really good friend who makes lovely, cool climate Syrah. And Syrah is another one like Chardonnay that can really be like winemaker and regionally driven. You know, you can do like fruitier ones or savory ones or meaty, gamey ones. I don't know. There's the impolite joke, which is off color and not nice about Syrah. Does anybody know it? Am I allowed to say it?
I don't know, but you can say it.
Okay. So the joke goes, what is the difference between a case of Syrah and a case of gonorrhea? And the answer is you can give someone a case of gonorrhea. So I see one or two. I told you guys it was an off-color naughty joke. So
No.
Syrah is hard to sell, I think. That is the point. The point being,
It's, I know it's,
you know what? The Syrah in Santa Lucia Highlands is actually stunning. And we are lucky because Mark Pizzoni usually throws 4 or 6 bottles of his Syrah that Jeff makes on top of my fruit. So when my fruit comes to the winery during harvest, we are usually the lucky recipients of Syrah, which we happily and greedily drink.
please consider it.
Yeah, I know that. And like I said, the SLH Syrahs are awesome. If you can, they're small production, but if you can find some, get your hands on them and grab them because they're delicious. Other questions? All right, I'm shaking in my boots next week because we're supposed to be making biscotti and I haven't actually, Steve, go ahead.
Okay. Generally, the literature says that Pinot Noir is tough to grow because of its thin skin. It's finicky. How do you feel? What's the difference between what you have to do in growing? Now, you obviously are having somebody grow the grapes for you, but in terms of Santa Lucia versus Petaluma Gap, is it easier to grow? Is it more forgiving than it would be out in Petaluma Gap, for example? What do you do differently? You've talked a little bit about that, but I'm thinking about even during the growing season. Maybe less canopy, more depending. What are some of the challenges there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Santa Lucia Highlands, I think the toughest part that makes it different from Petaluma Gap or different from Russian River Valley, where we are here, is that the botrytis pressure is heavy. You know, the fog comes in and it's almost like rain. It's like really, really, really dense. So that requires a lot of hands-on work in the vineyard, dropping clusters in the vineyard, always cutting off the wings. So, you know, there's the main grape cluster and there's like the little piece on the side. It's kind of like a chicken breast and a chicken tender, I guess. So they cut off the wings, which of course is labor and time consuming to try to open it up. Keeping the canopy opened up for airflow, shoot position and cluster position, limiting it of course to 2 clusters per shoot so that things aren't quite as dense in there, so it's intrinsically low yielding. And even with all of that, even with being really fastidious in terms of pest management, there are some years in Soberanes where just yields are low because there's a lot of clusters that need to get dropped, because even with the most meticulous farming, there's a lot of rot, there's a lot of botrytis, and that's a moisture issue. It's really damp down there.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, you guys. My glass is like literally empty. which I think is the sign that I'm going to let everybody go. Mark still has wine. Let everybody go until next week, which gives me 7 days to figure out the logistics of how I'm going to bake biscotti live. So I look forward to seeing everybody next week. Have a healthy week, and hopefully you get outside, you do some walking, you enjoy your own cellar and your own family, and I'll see you guys next week. Cheers.